When I released the previous version of this video a few years ago, back when I was still in high school, I had no idea how much worse the situation would become. Since then, both major political parties in the United States have questioned election results. The Capitol was stormed, and major cities in the Pacific Northwest experienced unrest, with violent riots spreading nationwide. The country is now more polarized than at any point in recent memory. This video takes an honest, unfiltered look at how a modern American civil war could unfold, who might prevail, what conditions would lead to it, and what factors would shape the conflict. We're here to address the multi-trillion-dollar question of whether the world's dominant power could be torn apart by its own internal divisions. Music. The last time the U.S. descended into civil war, the Union was commanded by one of the most accomplished military leaders in American history, Ulysses S. Grant. He ultimately cornered the elusive Robert E. Lee and brought the war to an end. Grant's life included an extraordinary military career followed by an equally eventful presidency. Magellan TV features an excellent series on him, along with many other renowned leaders, in their documentary collection The Great Commanders. It highlights figures ranging from Julius Caesar and Horatio Nelson to Zhukov and Grant. This high-quality docu-series is available on Magellan TV, a documentary streaming platform created by filmmakers who specialize in top-tier historical content. Magellan works on nearly any device, streams in 4K at no extra cost, and offers an impressive selection at an affordable price. Their library spans everything from ancient history to current events, along with topics such as science, nature, astronomy, and philosophy. Whatever your interests, Magellan TV has something worth watching. Viewers can get a 1-month free trial using the link in the video description. Recently, I visited the Philadelphia suburb where I lived as a teenager, one of the nation's most influential swing regions, often playing a decisive role in presidential elections. I stopped by 2 grocery stores, a Whole Foods and a Wegmans. What struck me was how quickly I could sense the political culture of each place. Within about 20 seconds, Whole Foods emphasized organic, fair trade, and vegetarian products, and the style of the shoppers in each store differed noticeably. I even received a few odd looks for dressing the way I normally do. This is just one example among many. We've reached a point where conservatives and progressives have distinct ways of talking, dressing, worshiping, teaching, eating, loving, virtually everything. It's remarkable how different regions feel when you travel from Kansas City to Boston and notice how visible people's political views are. A few weeks ago, while driving from Pennsylvania into Ohio, I counted around 5 Trump signs along the highway, including one burned directly into the grass. There were also numerous signs urging people to find God or condemning abortion. Right now, I'm in Los Angeles, and I've also lived briefly in New York. In both cities, openly left-leaning signs and billboards are common throughout the streets. Whenever someone claims that social justice isn't a real movement, I point out how Times Square featured a massive Disney billboard promoting Lading storytelling. The most extreme example I've seen in the U.S. was Portland, Maine, where it felt like most shops displayed some form of social justice-themed message. All of this becomes even more striking when you remember that, within living memory, back in the 1940s and 1950s, political polarization in America was practically non-existent. At the time, California was known for being almost anti-partisan. Interest in political parties was so limited that candidates often ran on both Democratic and Republican tickets simultaneously, or simply chose not to declare a party at all. A government report from 1949 even argued that Americans needed more political polarization because Republicans and Democrats didn't offer meaningful differences and often supported the same ideas. In many cases, party divisions reflected ethnic or religious backgrounds rather than actual policy disagreements. Today, we all understand that the country is deeply divided, but it raises a serious question. Could things realistically reach the point of another civil war? In a modern, developed society, is it possible that we could descend into violence against one another using guns, missiles, or even improvised weapons? And have similar situations occurred before? There are several models and theories people use to interpret or predict historical patterns. Many of them have value, but none should be treated as absolute truths. They require context and common sense. After years of studying this subject, it seems reasonable to view history as cyclical, though these cycles never repeat perfectly. Instead, countless cycles overlap and collide, creating the chaos and unpredictability that shape the events we end up experiencing. Even so, there are a few ways to frame the possibility of another U.S. civil conflict in the coming decades. One approach is the generational perspective. In short, it suggests that, for reasons that aren't entirely understood, English-speaking societies tend to. English-speaking societies appear to experience a major external conflict or internal civil war roughly every 80 years, which pushes them into a new era. The most recent example was World War II. Before that came the U.S. Civil War, then the American Revolution, and earlier still the English Civil War, the Spanish Armada, the Wars of the Roses, Hotspur's Rebellion, and conflicts that reach back to the Anglo-Saxon period. William Strauss and Neil Howe outlined this idea in their 1991 book Generations. They proposed a generational cycle in which specific archetypes repeat across time. In their model, idealistic baby boomers give rise to the more skeptical, material-focused Generation X, who in turn raise millennials, whom Strauss and Howe expected to be more leadership-oriented than they ultimately became. The pattern continues beyond that, and the authors traced these cycles back to the Middle Ages. Writing in the 1990s, they predicted that the United States would face a major political crisis comparable to the American Revolution, the Civil War, or World War II sometime in the 2020s. A second framework is the Turchin-Hackett-Fisher model, which longtime viewers of my channel have heard me discuss often. In his influential book The Great Wave, David Hackett-Fisher described how societies undergo periodic breakdowns every few centuries, usually driven by falling wages caused by population growth and increased globalization. In Europe, the most recent occurrences, depending on how you categorize them, were either World War I or the French Revolution. Peter Turchin expanded on Fisher's work, developing a comprehensive theory that shows these crises happening roughly every 250 years, going back to the Bronze Age. Using this approach, he built computer models that successfully matched the timing of major upheavals such as the Black Death, the Wars of Religion, and the Russian revolutions. In 2010, his models projected that the U.S. would face a severe crisis in the 2020s. The final set of models comes from thinkers like Spengler, Carroll Quigley, Amory, Toynbee, and Fabry. Several of these writers are considered among the most important scholars of the last century. If Strauss-Howe cycles span about 80 years and the Turchin-Fisher cycles last around 250, then the Spengler-Toynbee style cycles extend across roughly 2,500 years. These theories are complex, far too detailed to fully explain here, but they broadly argue that civilizations move through life stages, beginning with a spring of growth and ending in a winter period of decline. This decline usually occurs when the external world changes faster than the society can adapt and when cultural unity and religiosity weaken. Despite their differences, these authors largely agree on one point. The West, in its current philosophical and cultural stage, is in a position similar to that of ancient Rome around 100 BC. Fabry and Amory de Riencourt wrote influential works that explore these parallels in remarkable detail. To summarize, the late Roman Republic shows a world dominated by a single superpower republic facing turbulent internal politics and declining trust in its institutions. In its place, extremely wealthy and influential individuals rise to prominence, promising solutions to an increasingly urbanized, isolated, and economically strained population. Religion weakens sharply, and the economy becomes highly centralized, with most people effectively dependent on large, dominant corporations. Local cultures erode under the influence of a broader, homogenizing global culture. The once clear ideological divide between political groups, like Rome's optimates and populares, eventually becomes overshadowed by strong personality-driven movements. As you can tell, this is a topic I could discuss endlessly, but the subject is far too deep for a short section. I plan to make a separate video in the near future about whether America is following Rome's path, where I will explore these ideas in more detail. Human beings operate within the incentive structures shaped by our physical and ideological environments. Just as fish are unaware of the water around them, it's difficult for us to recognize how our surroundings shape our behavior. The Americans who now push to remove certain figures from school curriculums are descendants of the people who fought on the beaches of Normandy, within living memory. Yet the structure of today's society encourages Americans to turn against one another. To understand how a civil conflict could emerge in the U.S., we need to examine what pressures make people desperate enough to target their own citizens. The answer, in my view, is that many Americans today live lives marked by frustration and declining well-being, which makes violence seem like the only possible path to change. This may sound unusual when compared to historical eras defined by famine and widespread destitution, but pain remains pain, regardless of context. And modern America does face serious problems. As I've mentioned before, ordinary Americans have watched their quality of life fall sharply over the past 50 years. Wages have stagnated while the cost of living continues to rise. Consider examples from shows like The Simpsons or movies by John Hughes, where working-class families with several children owned homes and could routinely take vacations, situations that feel nearly impossible today even for many young people from upper-middle-class backgrounds. As I've described in earlier videos, the collapses, when I made the previous version of this video a couple of years ago, back when I was still in high school, I had no idea how much worse things would become. In the time since, we've watched both major political parties in the United States question the legitimacy of election results. The Capitol was breached, major cities in the Pacific Northwest saw open unrest, and violent riots spread across the country. Today, the nation is more divided than at any point in recent memory. This video aims to take a straightforward and unfiltered look at how a second American Civil War might unfold, who might come out on top, what conditions could trigger it, and the major factors that would shape the conflict. We're here to address the enormous question of whether the world's leading superpower could collapse under the weight of its own internal divisions. Thank you. The last time the U.S. descended into civil war, the Union was led by one of the most skilled commanders in American history, Ulysses S. Grant. He ultimately succeeded in cornering the elusive Robert E. Lee. Grant lived an extraordinary life and had an equally remarkable presidency. On Magellan TV, there's a great series covering him, as well as many other legendary military leaders, in their program The Great Commanders. It highlights figures ranging from Julius Caesar and Horatio Nelson to Zhukov and Grant. This impressive documentary series is available on Magellan TV, a streaming platform created by filmmakers that offers some of the best history-focused documentaries and films available. Magellan works on virtually any device and streams in 4K at no extra charge. It's a strong platform at an affordable price. Their library covers everything from ancient civilizations to modern events, as well as topics like nature and astronomy. No matter what you're interested in, science, history, philosophy, or anything else, Magellan TV has something worth watching. So check out Magellan TV today and dive into whatever subject captures your curiosity. Viewers of What If Alt-Hist can get a 1-month free trial through the link in the description. When I made the previous version of this video a couple of years ago, back when I was still in high school, I had no idea how much worse things would become. In the time since, we've watched both major political parties in the United States question the legitimacy of election results. The Capitol was breached, major cities in the Pacific Northwest saw open unrest, and violent riots spread across the country. Today, the nation is more divided than at any point in recent memory. This video aims to take a straightforward and unfiltered look at how a second American Civil War might unfold, who might come out on top, what conditions could trigger it, and the major factors that would shape the conflict. We're here to address the enormous question of whether the world's leading superpower could collapse under the weight of its own internal divisions. Thank you. The last time the U.S. descended into civil war, the Union was led by one of the most skilled commanders in American history, Ulysses S. Grant. He ultimately succeeded in cornering the elusive Robert E. Lee. Grant lived an extraordinary life and had an equally remarkable presidency. On Magellan TV, there's a great series covering him, as well as many other legendary military leaders, in their program The Great Commanders. It highlights figures ranging from Julius Caesar and Horatio Nelson to Zhukov and Grant. This impressive documentary series is available on Magellan TV, a streaming platform created by filmmakers that offers some of the best history-focused documentaries and films available. Magellan works on virtually any device and streams in 4K at no extra charge. It's a strong platform at an affordable price. Their library covers everything from ancient civilizations to modern events, as well as topics like nature and astronomy. No matter what you're interested in, science, history, philosophy, or anything else, Magellan TV has something worth watching. So check out Magellan TV today and dive into whatever subject captures your curiosity. Viewers of What If Alt-Hist can get a 1-month free trial through the link in the description. While visiting the suburb outside Philadelphia where I grew up, one of the most influential swing regions in the entire country, often shaping the outcome of presidential elections, I stopped at 2 grocery stores, Whole Foods and Wegmans. What shocked me was how quickly I could identify the political leanings of each environment. Within 20 seconds, the differences were obvious. Whole Foods prioritized organic, fair trade, and vegetarian options. The customers in each store dressed differently, and I even got strange looks just for dressing the way I normally do. I could list 15 more examples of this kind of divide. We've reached a point where conservatives and progressives differ in how they talk, dress, worship, teach, eat, form relationships, and practically everything else. It's strange how quickly the political atmosphere shifts when traveling across the country. Moving from Kansas City to Boston, it becomes obvious that people's political identities show up everywhere. A few weeks ago, while driving from Pennsylvania to Ohio, I counted roughly 5 Trump signs along the highway, including one literally burned into the grass. There were also numerous signs promoting religious messages or declaring that abortion is wrong. Right now, I'm in Los Angeles and I previously lived in New York. In both places, you'll find highly visible left-leaning signs and billboards throughout the streets. When people claim that social justice isn't a real movement, I point out things like the massive Times Square billboard from Disney encouraging the promotion of Lading stories. One of the most surprising places I've visited in the U.S. was Portland, Maine, where it felt like most businesses displayed some form of social justice-themed messaging. All of this becomes even more remarkable when considering that, within living memory, back in the 1940s and 1950s, political polarization in America was practically non-existent. California, for example, was known as an anti-partisan state, where people had so little interest in party labels that candidates commonly ran on both Democratic and Republican tickets at the same time, or didn't identify with a party at all. A 1949 government report even argued that Americans needed more political division because the two major parties weren't offering voters meaningful differences and were essentially advocating the same positions. At the time, party alignment was tied more to ethnic and religious identities than to actual policy disagreements. We all recognize that the U.S. is deeply divided today, but could things really deteriorate to the point of another civil war? Could a modern, developed nation actually descend into widespread violence with people turning weapons, guns, missiles, even blunt tools against their own neighbors? And has anything comparable ever happened before? There are multiple frameworks people use to analyze or predict historical trends. Many of them offer useful insights, but none should be treated as absolute truths. They require a lot of common sense. From my years studying this topic, it seems reasonable to believe that history moves in cycles, but these cycles don't repeat cleanly. Different patterns unfold at the same time, overlapping and clashing in ways that create instability and unpredictability, ultimately shaping the events we'll face in the future. Still, there are a few approaches that suggest the U.S. could face another civil conflict in the coming decades. The first is based on generational theory. The simplified explanation is that, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, the English-speaking world tends to experience a major external crisis or internal civil conflict roughly every 80 years. The most recent of these major shocks was World War II, and before that came the U.S. Civil War and the American Revolution. Earlier examples include the English Civil War, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the Wars of the Roses, Hotspur's Rebellion, and even earlier conflicts reaching back to the Anglo-Saxon period. William Strauss and Neil Howe explored this idea in their 1991 book Generations, where they outlined a generational cycle theory suggesting that distinct generational archetypes repeat over time. Their model proposes that idealistic baby boomers produced the more detached and material-focused Gen X, who then raised millennials, whom Strauss and Howe believed would grow into a strong, leadership-oriented generation, although that prediction has been widely debated. Their analysis stretches back to the Middle Ages, and in the 1990s they forecast that the United States would encounter a major political crisis, on the scale of the Revolution, the Civil War, or World War II, sometime in the 2020s. Another approach is the Turchin-Hackett-Fisher model. Longtime viewers are probably tired of hearing me mention it, since it's featured heavily in earlier videos. In his book The Great Wave, David Hackett-Fisher showed that societies experience periodic breakdowns over several centuries, often driven by falling wages caused by population growth and increased global integration. In the European world, the most recent examples, depending on how you measure them, were World War I and the French Revolution. Peter Turchin expanded this framework in significant ways, developing a systematic theory that tracks these upheavals approximately every 250 years, going all the way back to the Bronze Age. Using historical data, he built computer models that successfully predicted the timing of major disruptions including the Black Death, the wars of religion, the Russian revolutions, and others. In 2010, those same models indicated that the U.S. would experience a severe crisis in the 2020s. The final set of theories comes from thinkers like Oswald Spengler, Carroll Quigley, A.M. Dreyecker, and Fabry. Two of these authors are considered among the most influential scholars of the last century. If the Strauss-Howe cycle spans roughly 80 years and the Turchin-Fisher cycle covers about 250, then the Spengler and Amori framework operates on an even larger scale of roughly 2,500 years. Each of these theories is too complex to fully explain without producing an overwhelming wall of text, but in general, they argue that civilizations move through life cycle phases, from spring to winter, gradually losing vitality as the world changes and as religious or cultural cohesion declines. Despite their differences, all these authors broadly agree on one point. They believe the modern West is positioned similarly to where ancient Rome stood around 100 BC. Fabry and Amaury Dreyecker have written compelling works that explore this idea in remarkable depth. To simplify, our current situation resembles the final decades of the Roman Republic. We live in a world dominated by one primary superpower, yet that power struggles with internal instability and weakening trust in institutions. At the same time, we see the rise of extremely wealthy, influential individuals who appeal to an urbanized, isolated, and financially strained population by promising to solve every problem. Religious involvement has dropped sharply, and the economy has become centralized to the point where many people work for massive corporations. Local cultures have been overshadowed by a globalized dominant culture. The once major differences between political factions, similar to Rome's optimates and populares, have largely been replaced by personality-driven movements. As you can imagine, I could talk about this analogy endlessly, but the topic is far too deep to fully explore here. I plan to create a separate video soon, Is America the Next Rome?, where I'll examine this comparison in much greater detail. People exist within incentive structures shaped by the physical and ideological worlds around them. Just as fish are mostly made of the water they swim in, it's difficult for us to recognize how the environments we live in have shaped who we are and how we behave. The Americans who today push for removing certain groups from curriculums are the descendants of the same people who fought on the beaches of Normandy not that long ago. Yet the structure of modern society encourages Americans to resent one another. To understand how a civil conflict could emerge, we must first understand what conditions would make people feel desperate enough to turn against their own fellow citizens. My argument is that many Americans today live unhappy and financially strained lives, which makes them more willing to consider extreme actions as a way to seek change. This may seem odd from a historical standpoint. After all, past societies often faced starvation or extreme poverty, but suffering is still suffering, and the United States faces real problems today. As I've explained in earlier videos, average Americans have watched their standard of living decline sharply over the past 50 years. Wages have stayed relatively stagnant while the cost of living has risen dramatically. Look at examples like The Simpsons or John Hughes films from the 1980s. Middle or working-class families with several children could own homes and take vacations as a normal part of life. That level of stability is nearly unthinkable for many young upper-middle-class people today. As I've also discussed, the collapse of community life and the sharp decrease in sexual relationships among Americans have produced a population that is restless, frustrated, and often unstable. Human beings are naturally social and sexual creatures, and when the ability to form families or build consistent social bonds disappears, here is your polished, professional paraphrasing of Part 9, following all your instructions. Same length, same structure, simplified flow, less than 10% change in meaning, no added drama, and all key ideas preserved. Underscore today. Most young people can barely afford to enter relationships or maintain stable social circles. And when this happens, societies lose their direction and start slipping toward tribalism and breakdown. These issues fall most heavily on young men, the group you least want to alienate. In many respects, the long-term stability of a nation depends on how it treats its young men. With high energy and strong biological drives, they will push forward in whatever direction is available. When there are too many restless young men, they either cooperate and expand outward as a group or turn their aggression inward. Historically, many societies encouraged marriage at very young ages, often around 15, and arranged partnerships largely to ensure that young men became sexually fulfilled and quickly invested in their communities. This increased stability, though it often came at the cost of creativity and social mobility. Today, the situation looks very different. Because of how dating apps work, young men are having far less sex. They earn less than young women on average. They grow up hearing messages that label masculinity as harmful, and society offers them few clear paths toward purpose, honor, or belonging. It's hard to imagine conditions more suited to creating a frustrated, volatile group that could easily become the foundation of a political or military movement. And unlike many countries, the US actually has a large young male population, the biggest among developed nations, and one of the lowest average ages. If young men represent one major demographic linked to civil conflict, the second group is what Peter Turchin calls elite aspirants. These include entrepreneurs, military officers, doctors, academics, and other members of the upper middle class or upper class who are seeking greater influence or status. When wages are strong and opportunities are plentiful, these groups are usually content, which leads to lower political tension. But today, because of automation, globalization, immigration, and several other downward pressures on wages, even advanced degrees no longer guarantee a stable or fulfilling life. In many cases, even graduates of elite universities end up in demanding corporate jobs that drain their time and energy. In my own experience, the only people who consistently find financial success are those who are self-employed, CEOs, freelancers, influencers, because they aren't trapped in a labor market where wages have been driven so low. People often ask why social justice, a movement framed around helping the disadvantaged, is so common among the upper middle classes. The reason is that many frustrated elite aspirants use social justice language as a way to gain moral authority and elevate their social status in an era when climbing the social ladder is extremely difficult. I've discussed in earlier videos how this dynamic plays a major role in shaping the political divide in the United States today. To simplify the comparison, our situation resembles the final stage of the Roman Republic. We see a world dominated by a single superpower struggling with internal political turmoil and decreasing trust in major institutions. At the same time, extremely wealthy and influential figures gain prominence, appealing to an urban, isolated, and financially strained population by offering broad promises to solve the nation's problems. Religion has declined sharply, and the economy has become so centralized that many people now work for a handful of massive corporations. Local cultures have been eroded by the widespread influence of a globalized, dominant culture. The once significant distinctions between political parties, similar to the Optimates and Populars in Rome, have gradually faded, replaced by movements centered around individual personalities. As you can probably tell, I could spend hours exploring this comparison, but the topic is far too deep for this video alone. I plan to release a dedicated video soon titled Is America the Next Rome?, where I'll examine this idea in much greater depth. People exist within the incentive structures shaped by the physical and ideological environments around them. Just as fish are mostly composed of the water they swim in, it's difficult for us to recognize how our surroundings shape our behavior and worldview. The Americans who now advocate removing certain groups from school curricula are the descendants of those who fought on the beaches of Normandy, within living memory. Yet our society is organized in a way that encourages Americans to resent each other. To understand how the U.S. could fall into a civil conflict, we need to examine what pressures might push people to feel desperate enough to turn against one another. My argument is that many Americans today live unhappy and economically strained lives, leading some to believe that drastic measures are the only path to meaningful change. This may seem unusual from a historical perspective, where starvation and extreme poverty were common, but suffering is still suffering, and the problems in the U.S. today are significant. As I've explained throughout this video, ordinary Americans have experienced a steep decline in living standards over the past 50 years. Wages have remained relatively stagnant while the cost of living has surged. Look at examples like The Simpsons or films by John Hughes. In the 1980s, working-class families with several children could own homes and take vacations as a normal part of life. That lifestyle is nearly impossible today, even for young people in the upper middle class. On top of that, the collapse of community structures and the decrease in sexual and social relationships among Americans have left many people restless, angry, and unstable. Humans are naturally social and sexual beings, and when the ability to form families is undermined, society deteriorates. Much of this comes from pushing everyone into the college,